Following a practical, repeatable, teachable system for developing leaders is an important step to delegating decision-making and problem-solving. This is part 5 of a 5-part series on how to develop up-and-coming leaders. Stay tuned and I'll share another step to address early on that has proven to work well for me when developing leaders to make solid decisions I can trust.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
For many business owners and leaders, a problem they desperately want to solve is developing effective leaders in their organizations so they can delegate decision-making, problem-solving, and just to get out of the weeds. While this is both important and urgent, it's also common to not have certainty about where to start, and that's exactly what we're covering in this 5-part series, of which this is part 5. It's a practical series of strategies to develop leaders we can trust. Now, as I mentioned in the episode 3, the first 2, I'm pretty certain I want to get those first 2 parts done immediately. If you haven't listened to those, I'd recommend you go back and listen to those episodes. But starting in part 3 of this series and part 4, and certainly now part 5, I'm not so rigid about the sequential order. Taking care of one before the other probably won't be that big of a deal. But these are all concepts and strategies I want to get out in front of earlier rather than later. Now, in this episode, we're going to focus solely on clarity. Clarity in 2 parts. Clarity of our overall strategy of where we want decisions made, and when an up-and-coming leader should make decisions completely on their own, create a plan and run it by me before executing, and when they should gather information and bring it to me so I can make the decision and give direction and have them go out and execute. Why is getting this kind of clarity helpful and necessary? Because it's very common for business owners to have frustrations that their up-and-coming leaders don't take the initiative to solve problems on their own, don't see resolutions all the way through, things like that. It's very common for business owners and leaders to say, I wish my managers would do more of this. That is generally taking initiative to solve problems, take responsibility on and things like that. I probably have a version of that conversation at least once a week with my own clients. And I remember having that exact same frustration myself. So the other part of this, though, is not only was I one of those developing leaders myself, but I also have had many conversations with those up-and-coming leaders as their peer many years ago, as a manager with a different rank on the org chart than them, as a friend. I have friends who are leaders in organizations. They're managers who have a manager with a higher rank they report to. And I have no relationship with the company, but I have friends who are in those roles. And of course, I've had conversations with those developing leaders as an advisor. And something that stood out to me greatly, it really has stood out to me. Just as it's common for business owners and leaders to have frustration that their subordinate managers don't just take the ball and run with it, the subordinate managers are just as frustrated that boss won't either get out of the way or give them some guidance. Well, how could that be? In my opinion, it's just a matter of not having the amount of clarity that would be helpful to resolve this. So here's what I did to overcome this in my own situation. First of all, I talked about we need to have clarity about where decisions are to be made in the organization in general. So what's our overall strategy for decision making and problem solving? As I've discussed before many times in this podcast, I'm a firm believer that decisions should be made to the lowest possible level, not the highest possible level. I've covered that many times before. There's many episodes we've gone in that, so I'm not going to dwell on that a whole lot. But just a quick reminder: decisions made at the lowest possible level lead to improvement. But companies aiming for compliance make decisions at the highest possible level, which does not allow the business owner or person at the top of the org chart to have any kind of freedom. If I have to make all the decisions because the decisions are made at the highest possible level, it means they can't ever go anywhere. I can't ever focus on anything, even if I'm at work and I want to focus on other things. I can't because I have to make all these decisions. And as I mentioned before, I'm selfish and I want to have freedom. And therefore, I want decisions to be made at the lowest possible level, not the highest. But without any training, top-down decision making is what most developing leaders will default to. They will just naturally believe I was put in this role because they trust me, which is true, and therefore they want me to make all the decisions, which is not always true. And I need to get out in front of that right away. So along with establishing that overall goal for each of my developing managers, that our strategies for decisions to be made at the lowest possible level, I also solved another part of the problem, which is breaking down their overall responsibility into types of problems or areas of responsibility. So let's use an operations manager as an example. You're going to have lots of things that this operations manager does. There's hiring and onboarding, disciplinary actions and firing, training, safety or risk mitigation, customer service issues or customer complaint resolution, scheduling and job assignments, basic employee performance, like attendance, that kind of stuff, employee behavioral issues like communication, and employee task issues like following processes and procedures. And then, of course, there's problem solving, of which you could even break that down a little bit further. But for each of those areas, it was necessary for me and the developing manager to have clarity with when is it appropriate and or necessary for this up and coming leader to make decisions I would support without any involvement from me. That's kind of one bucket. There's three. So one of them is without much involvement from me. These are things they should just go out and do in each of those categories, like training, disciplinary action, job assignment, behavioral issues, like all any of those things. What are the kinds of scenarios where I shouldn't have to have any involvement? They're at a point in their understanding, knowledge, ability to utilize strategies that they go out and take care of these kinds of problems in that kind of realm of responsibility without any involvement from me. And when is it appropriate and or necessary for them to, this developing leader to create a plan of action, but not actually take action until I approve it. So they're going to kind of figure out what they want to do, bring it to me, and I'm going to sign off on it, and then they're going to go do it. That would be like a second category. And the third category is when is it appropriate and or necessary for them to gather information and bring it to me, and I make a decision and they go carry it out. So those are kind of the three different ways of us, handling things. One is complete involvement with them, not very much for me. One is they kind of create a plan, I sign off on it or help them alter it and then sign off on it. And the third one is they gather information, bring it to me, I make a decision, they execute. This was absolutely critical for me and my, developing leaders that were up and coming so I could again have freedom where I could focus on other things. This kind of clarity was absolutely life-changing for us because we didn't have this resentment anymore. We didn't have this frustration. I wasn't saying I wish so and so would go do this, and they were simultaneously thinking I wish Brian would get out of my way, or I wish Brian would help me understand how he wants this done. All very, very common. So the first step is to establish that kind of clarity. And this is not as time consuming as you would think. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But breaking a person's roles and responsibilities down into different categories like that isn't all that time consuming. And it's something we should all do, as soon as possible. So once I've established that kind of clarity, the next step is perhaps the hardest, at least for me anyway. And that is for me to actually honor my part of the bargain and resist my temptation to step in and make command decisions that would violate our agreement and understanding. So if I've said Joe has responsibility to go take care of this kind of problem as it relates to, problem solving or employee behaviors or whatever, I don't get to just veto that and then just decide I'm going to go make a decision now. I have to honor the agreement we've made because if I don't honor that, now we don't have clarity again. Now, are there exceptions to this? Yes. But the exceptions cannot become just the way we do it. And it can't just be on a whim. And of course, if the manager's on vacation, things like that, of course, I might need to step in a different capacity. Or if something is really urgent, I see somebody who's going to do something that is very risky, of course, I'm going to step in. But I have to be very, very mindful of honoring the boundaries that we've established. The next step then is, of course, to hold a developing leader accountable to take the actions we've agreed upon, even when they're uncomfortable for the manager, which they're often going to be. The as we grow in our leadership skills and employ new strategies, it's not always very fun, and sometimes it's quite uncomfortable. And part of my role is to hold them accountable to do these things, even when, or especially when, they're uncomfortable. The other thing is these assignments of responsibility, these boundaries we're going to establish, these buckets, they're going to change. Um, I kind of liken it to, like, for people who are young and listening, this may not make a whole lot of sense, but I think you'll get the concept. In the old days, 20, 30 years ago, when you learned how to drive a car, it was usually somebody who you knew who taught you. It was your parent or a sibling or an aunt maybe or whatever. And there was kind of a methodology we all use for teaching somebody how to drive a car. The first thing you do is like get him in there and sit in the driver's seat and like look around, like here's the gas pedal, here's the brake, here's the transmission, here's the blinker, like here's all the things. Like here's the things you're gonna need to know. That was kind of the first step. The second step was we would take him to like a vacant high school parking lot on a Sunday because there's nothing around that you could damage except for the light pole in the middle of the parking lot that had the concrete base. The worst case scenario, you'd bump into that. But there's, dozens or hundreds of parking spaces, plenty of room. Not a lot can happen. It's bad. And you take them there and you kind of, get used to stepping on the gas pedal, get used to stepping on the brake, get used to shifting gears back in the old days, using a turn signal. Just get familiar with like how the car operates. Once we get past that, then we move on to like a rural or a 25-mile-an-hour road, kind of out where you're not likely to encounter a bunch of traffic. But if you do, you have plenty of room. And then you might move to more of an urban street, like a 35 or 45-mile-an-hour street, where there is more traffic, and you have to be mindful of what's going on around you, and you have to be, able to predict and deal with what other drivers around you are doing. And then you would move on to a freeway, and then the person gets their driver's license, but then they can't have passengers, or they can't be out after dark. Different kinds of rules like that. And then a year later, like they have their driver's license, they've had it for a while, and like they do everything. And that's kind of the same path I follow with people in up and coming leadership roles. For each of these scenarios, like disciplinary actions. Okay, well, what is my high school parking lot version of that? What is the version where I'm just showing them, like they might sit in on a conversation, like I'm showing them, like here's how things operate, like that very first day of driving a car before you even drive around the high school parking lot. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it feels like to sit in the seat. And so, we might do some stuff like that. And then you move on to more basic things. Okay, you're going to handle conversations around attendance, with somebody who's a relatively new employee or things like that. And what is that? How do those responsibilities change as they get more comfortable, more understanding, more skills, more ability to predict what's going to happen, more tools in their toolbox? I don't like that cliche phrase, but you get the gist. Like more strategies that they can employ to handle more complex situations. It's going to change like that. So for these areas, me and this developing leader need to kind of know, like, what, given your current understanding, your current knowledge, your current ability to use different strategies, what are the limitations of things that you shouldn't get into? What are the kinds of things like, hey, you develop a plan, what you think would be best, and you bring it to me and I sign off on it and you go do it? Or what are things like, holy smokes, this is a big thing. I got to bring it to the boss and they need to make a decision and I'll help them carry it out however we want. It's going to change as they develop more skills. And part of what worked for me was having regular conversations. Now, in my case, it was a weekly meeting with just a leadership team, and we talked about these things. And sometimes we talk about them one-on-one, of course, but oftentimes we talk about this stuff in a group. Like what are the kinds of situations that you're encountering? What are the things that you should be doing on your own without my help? And sometimes they would have an answer, and I'd say, "No, I think you're a little bit more prepared for this stuff than you think. Why don't you give it a shot?" And sometimes they might be a little too eager, and I'd be like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!" This is something that I want to have at least some involvement in, or an understanding what's going on. Or in other cases, like, "No, you bring this to me, and I'm going to make a decision, then you'll execute." So I hope that's helpful. It's something that really worked for me. And again, I want to stress it takes time to develop this. Have these conversations with the leadership team, which, in my opinion, you either make the time to have the conversations with before you have problems, or you make the time to deal with the problems afterwards. That's kind of how I look at it. I'm a firm believer that what's the saying? An ounce of cure is better than a pound of prevention, or an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. I firmly believe in that analogy as it relates to developing leaders. I would much rather have more involvement up front to make sure we're on the same page and we're doing things relatively the same way and we agree on the kinds of strategies we want to use than I would to not invest that time and invest a whole bunch of time dealing with the consequences later on. That's a personal preference. But breaking down these areas of responsibility for a manager's role is not likely to take more than 30 to 60 minutes, probably. I mean, you could probably do it in 10 or 15, honestly. But let's say it takes you an hour, worst case scenario. And then developing some kind of qualifiers or restrictions to determine when they should make those decisions autonomously, when they should do it with help or not at all. And they just, gather information and bring it to you. Again, figuring that out shouldn't take hours and hours and hours either. But you are undoubtedly going to find areas you're not really sure where it's appropriate for them to act alone, where it's appropriate to create a plan and run it by you first, and when it's appropriate for them to act only after you've given some direction. And by the way, when you uncover those areas, that's like Yahtzee. Like, that's fantastic because we've uncovered the reasons they're not doing things that you're frustrated they're not doing. If you don't have clarity on what kinds of things they should do alone, with help, or with direction, how could they possibly have clarity on that? The answer is they can't. The answer is we're all just winging it and bumping into each other once in a while and leaving gaping holes once in a while. So when you uncover these areas, as you undoubtedly will, they are fantastic opportunities to have conversations with that leader or your leadership team to figure it out together. And that kind of clarity will get you all on the same page, even if it's just to agree that we have some things we still need to figure out. Even just having that agreement is massive clarity, and it's really, really helpful in having a unified, cohesive leadership team. And having that kind of clarity and having that cohesive leadership team will greatly reduce the friction, frustration, and resentment from them not acting in the way we wish they would. So, as usual, if you find the information I share helpful, please share this podcast with a friend or colleague you think could benefit from it. Again, leadership development is something I've been asked to talk about the most. So I know you have friends who are business owners or business leaders who could use some help with this kind of thing. This is a very, very common frustration. And of course, public sharing is appreciated also. And that's it for this week, and I'll talk to you all next week.